Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to present to the National Farmers Union Region 1 Convention. Really pleased to do that. My name is Darrin Qualman. I'm the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action for the National Farmers Union. I am delivering this presentation from my home about 30 minutes south of Saskatoon, so greetings from Saskatchewan. My presentation tonight is entitled Food, Farms, Climate, and the Future. 8 things people need to know and 8 policies we need. And before I get to the presentation itself, I just want to say a little bit about the National Farmers Union's policy work on climate change. So the NFU is positioned to be a Canadian leader. The NFU has the best analysis of any farm group. We are the most advanced in figuring out where the emissions come from, how farms can reduce emissions and make themselves more resilient, but also how we can do that at the same time that we support family farms, increase margins and net income, and create a better future. Not only deal with the climate crisis, but actually deal with some of the other things that we need to deal with for family farms in Canada. The National Farmers Union was a founding member of the Coalition Farmers for Climate Solutions, FCS, and representatives of FCS and the NFU recently met with both the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Environment. Tremendous success in government relations. And in a tremendous coup, Farmers for Climate Solutions and the NFU and others writing letters to the Minister, to the Prime Minister, managed to get into the throne speech wording that it would be a government priority to work with farmers toward emission reduction, climate solutions, and climate resilience. So tremendous success there. And by getting it into the throne speech, that means those will get into the mandate letters for ministers and be made priorities for those ministers and their staff. That's real help in our policy and government relations work. And the final thing I'll say is our policy work on climate is important. It's critical that we solve this problem, but it's also part of our work on every other issue the NFU works on. The climate crisis gives us an opportunity. We can use this as a lever to shift other policies. Right now, the trend lines in Canada, many of them are very negative. We're losing farms, we're losing young farmers, debt is increasing. The government policies are wrong, and we think that the climate crisis provides a historic moment that we can take advantage of in order to make a whole bunch of other changes in Canadian agriculture policy. So it's important that we work on this for its own sake, but also because it gives us a way of shifting other policies that need to be changed. These are 3 2-page flyers we recently published as part of our policy work. The first one parallels a lot of the points I'm going to make tonight, what people should know about climate crisis and agricultural emissions and what policies we need to deal with that. The second one outlines how NFU members and associate members can help advance our policy work. And the third one helps farmers think about what they can do on their own farms as they plan for the medium and long term, how they can integrate emission reduction into that planning. So let me just launch right in with my presentation. I'm going to give you 8 things that you need to know about agriculture and climate and emissions, and then look at 8 government policies we need in order to support farmers in moving to low emission, climate compatible, sustainable, resilient farming methods. Thank you for the opportunity. So 8 things we should know. First one, greenhouse gas concentrations in the earth are very high and going up very fast. Many of you will know there are 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. I'm going to go through each one. So to begin with carbon dioxide, CO2, this is a graph of 800,000 years of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Just to give you a context, 800,000 years is 4 times longer than human beings have existed as a species, so it's a very long time. You can see that over the past 800,000 years, CO2 levels have gone up and gone down, but notice, first of all, not once have they peaked above 300 parts per million. Not once have they gone higher than that, except in recent years. We're now up to about 420 parts per million, and we're probably heading for about 500 parts per million. So the first thing I want you to notice about this graph is that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are at levels that are unprecedented in the last 800,000 to a million years. Second thing I want you to notice is how fast they're going up. It usually takes about 10,000 years for emissions to go up by 100 parts per million. They've gone up by that much in just 100 years. So instead of taking 10,000 years, they've gone up that much in 100 years. What we're seeing is that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are rising about 100 times faster than they have previously in the geological record. The second major greenhouse gas, methane. The time scale here is a bit different. It's 10,000 years. But notice too just how fast emissions are rising, how much higher they are than what they've been over the last 10,000 years. We see that methane concentrations in the atmosphere were at about 600 parts per billion. The units are a bit different here, parts per billion instead of parts per million. 600 parts per billion for about 10,000 years, and then the last century or two, they've tripled up to 1,800 parts per billion. The main sources of methane are rice paddy production, waste methane from landfills, oil and gas production, and cattle. And we're going to talk quite a bit about cattle here later on in the presentation. This slide shows the third major greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide. Again, higher levels at any time in the last 800,000 to a million years, and going up very rapidly. The main source of nitrous oxide emissions is nitrogen fertilizer use. Fourth thing I want to show you is temperature increases. Not surprising if the concentrations of the three main greenhouse gases are going up. Temperatures are also going up. This shows you that temperatures started increasing in the 1980s very rapidly. They're now up almost a full degree over where they were through most of the 20th century, with some of the hotter months in recent years pushing toward 1.5 degrees. We're certainly going to get 1.5 degrees of warming. We're almost certainly going to get 2, and the track we're on right now will take us to about 3 degrees or more. The fifth thing is just to give you a picture of the sources of agricultural emissions. I've got graphs for Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick. Apologies that I didn't get time to do Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. These graphs take a long time to put together, but I'll just walk you through PEI in New Brunswick. These graphs cover the last 28 years, 1990 to 2018. There's a lot of different categories in here, but really emissions come down to 3 main categories. At the bottom, that blue, the dark blue and the light blue, that's mainly nitrogen fertilizer related, both the production of the nitrogen fertilizer and the use in the soil. The red in the middle is fuel use, and the green at the top is enteric emissions from cattle, the methane that comes out of their mouths when they digest grass, and the light green is manure management. When most of us think about greenhouse gas emissions, we think about carbon dioxide and fuel use and cars and maybe the exhaust pipes on our tractors or trucks. But really, on our farms, most of the emissions come in the form of nitrous oxide and methane, not carbon dioxide, and most of it comes from fertilizer use and from livestock production, not from the combustion of fossil fuels in machinery. This is the same graph for New Brunswick. You see the same sorts of things. The blue at the bottom is mostly nitrogen related. The red in the middle is fuel related. And then the green at the top is livestock, mostly cattle, and also manure management. A little different from PEI, there's the yellow band. That is emissions from lime and certain types of fertilizer. I think there must be a lot of lime use in New Brunswick and not in PEI, so that's why that yellow band is there. I'll just point out that the variations in the top line, the variations in total emissions in New Brunswick and PEI and probably Nova Scotia, because their graph would probably look similar. It's largely a function of fertilizer use. When fertilizer use goes up, that blue area at the bottom increases, more emissions related to fertilizer. So if you look at the graph on the left, it's the tons of nitrogen fertilizer used in the Atlantic provinces. The graphs on the right are the ones I showed you before, PEI, New Brunswick emissions. You can see that the top line and that blue area more or less parallels the graph of fertilizer use. So really the increases and decreases that you would see in your provincial agricultural emissions it's largely a function of whether farmers are using more nitrogen fertilizer or less. And when we look at the larger Canadian situation or most other provinces, it really is driven by nitrogen fertilizer use. When emissions go up in Canada, and they have been going up quite steadily, it's because people are doubling and redoubling nitrogen fertilizer tonnage. And the takeaway from that is, if we want to reduce emissions in agriculture in Canada, we probably need to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use. Just a quick note on soil carbon sequestration, and I'll go over this slide very quickly. People often point to no-till and other ways of getting carbon into the soil. This is a graph from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. For all of Canada, the brown or black bars going up are emissions from farming, and the gold bars going down are sequestration. You can see that sequestration is relatively modest compared to agricultural emissions. And for reasons I won't go into right now, sequestration is actually decreasing in Canada, not increasing. So it's becoming more modest over time. Last thing I want to point out is some things around farm income. These are farm income graphs for New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. The black line that goes up is gross farm revenue. The gray line that doesn't go up is realized net farm income. And I'll just color this in a little bit. I should note two things. One, the numbers are adjusted for inflation. So you can compare numbers from the 40s or 60s or 70s to numbers to today. And government subsidies have been subtracted out, both for the revenue and the net income. So this is gross revenue from the markets without government payments, and net income from the markets without government payments. So I'll just color these in. You can see the green areas there, those are years of positive net income. The red are years of negative net income. And I'll just color in a little more here. This is the part I want to focus in on, that blue area. The blue area is the difference between what farmers take home when they sell their products and what they have left after they pay their bills. The blue area represents farmers' costs, the money they give to machinery companies, fertilizer companies, chemical companies, fuel companies, banks, etc. And you can see how that blue area gets wider and wider and wider. And key to the NFU analysis is this. Farmers have been pushed, pressured, made to be far, far too reliant on purchased inputs. And as farmers have become more dependent on purchased inputs, more and more of the wealth they create is siphoned off into that blue area, into that area captured by fertilizer companies, chemical companies, fuel companies, machinery companies, banks, etc. And I just want to show you the percentages there because they're quite stark. In New Brunswick, from the end of the Depression until the mid-80s, farmers were keeping almost half of every dollar that they produced. They'd make $1 and the input companies would take about half. But from the mid-80s till now, the farmers' share that they get to keep after they pay their bills is only about 7%. And in PEI, it's even more stark. From the end of the Depression up until the mid-80s, farmers were keeping about 1/3, and now they're keeping just 4%. So clearly, as farmers have been encouraged to become more and more dependent on purchased inputs, their margins have gone down, their net incomes have been pushed down, and their emissions have gone up. What we say in the NFU is that agriculture doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions, agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. Humans have farmed for about 10,000 years, but for 9,900 of those years, they didn't affect the climate or the atmosphere. It's only in the last 100 years that agriculture has become a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's no coincidence that that's the time we become more and more dependent on purchased farm inputs. So as we use more inputs, our emissions go up and our margins and net income go down. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to some of the policies we need in order to reverse some of these negative trends. The first is around nitrogen. You saw that nitrogen is really the driver for increases in emissions. So we need to use nitrogen more efficiently. There's something called the 4R best management practices, and that stands for the right product, the right formulation, as it were, in the right amount, at the right time, in the right place, placed with seed, usually that means. So we need to use nitrogen more efficiently. We need to use less nitrogen. So we need things like independent soil testing, maybe a small tax on nitrogen in order to fund research that would help farmers find ways to use less nitrogen. And maybe we need some targets for overall reduction. In the European Union, they have a target to reduce nitrogen use by 20% over the next 10 years. And we need to produce nitrogen without emissions. So we need to find a way to run nitrogen fertilizer plants using renewable energy, and we need to capture the emissions coming off those plants, the carbon emissions coming off those plants. Second thing, we need to diversify cropping approaches. We need more complex rotations, we need to use more cover crops, and we need to investigate intercropping. We need to multiply the number and the area of organic farms. We need to embrace production methods such as agroecology and holistic management. And just generally, we need to increase the number of farms on the landscape. The more farms we have on the landscape, the better they are to observe what's happening to the climate, make changes on their farms, innovate, adapt, etc. If there's only a small number of very large, highly leveraged, very specialized farms, those are not the kind of farms that can quickly adapt to a changing climate. We need low input methods. We framed one in our report tackling the farm crisis and the climate crisis. We call it MINT agriculture. That stands for minimum input, no till. And essentially what that system does is it takes all the best ideas of organic agriculture and all the best ideas of zero till, no till, and puts them together into a system that maintains high yields, but at the same time does things like tries to get as much nitrogen and fertility as possible using biological rather than industrial systems. Cattle. A lot of the emissions that you saw in those graphs come from cattle. We need to change our goals and the way we proceed, our means, when it comes to cattle production and meat. So we know that cattle emit methane when they eat grass, but we also know that cattle provide many benefits. They're critical parts of healthy grassland ecosystems. They provide manure and nutrient cycling, diversification on mixed farms, etc. So cattle build soils and increase carbon levels. I ran across a quote that said, God doesn't farm without animals. So we need to find a way to keep cattle on the landscape, but we need to also tackle the methane problem. Remember, these are the graphs I showed you before. That green at the top, that's largely cattle. The dark green is mostly cattle methane. It's a very significant part of agricultural emissions in every province in Canada. So we've got certain goals and we're proceeding in a certain way, but we can probably proceed in a different way. So one goal is to maximize soil building and soil carbon levels. If we want to do that, we need animals grazing on grass and really good grazing management. We want animals grazing on grass, but the industry approach increasingly is to put animals in feedlots and barns. Another goal might be to maximize the number of sustainable livelihoods. So that means we want many small and medium-sized dispersed production units, as many farms as we can have. But the industry approach is to push everything toward mega operations and concentrated production. Around cattle, we might want to maximize the enjoyment from meat production and consumption. So what's needed there is a focus on quality and excellence, the way that some European countries really focus on the quality of their meats and their cheeses and their foods. But the industry approach is maximum production of commodity protein, maximize exports, maximize the number of burgers sold in drive-through restaurants. Another goal around the cattle system might be to maximize the supply of food for humans. And how we could do that would be to have animals eating wastes or grazing on land that couldn't feed people. The industry approach is to feed animals on grain that could otherwise be used to feed people. And finally, we might want to maximize the chance of reducing methane. That would mean fewer animals and less meat consumption. The industry approach, certainly globally, is more animals and ever higher consumption of meat. Another policy we'd want to switch over to low emission electricity away from fossil fuels. We'd want to electrify water and building heating, electrify trucks and tractors, install on-farm solar arrays, maybe manure biodigesters with methane capture. And when we build new buildings, we want to build them to very high standards like passive house or net zero or LEED standards. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of reducing emission from energy use, from natural gas, diesel fuel, gasoline, etc. Sixth, we probably want to set aside some land. So the land that is the least productive, we might be using a lot of inputs, not getting much crop, maybe losing money year after year, but producing a lot of emissions and not much crop and not much net income. We might want to take that marginal land, 5 to 10% of the crop land, for instance, we might want to set that aside, turn it into grassland, forest, wetlands, wildlife habitat. A lot of benefits there. We increase the soil organic carbon, we create wildlife habitat, we slow the rate of extinction, etc. So we probably want some set-aside programs. Those reduce emissions. Second last, we want some new institutions. One of them that the NFU has identified is the Canadian Farm Resilience Authority, the CFRA. And that's based on the PFRA that was destroyed by the previous government. The CFRA would manage independent soil testing so farmers could better understand their fertilizer needs and maybe use less fertilizer. They could manage research into reducing fertilizer use. They could administer the set-aside programs. They could help farmers utilize grazing best management practices like rotational grazing, holistic management, regenerative agriculture, etc. And in general, they could oversee all of the technical aspects of a transition to low emission, climate compatible agriculture. Finally, and this will always be controversial, we might want a carbon tax and refund system for agriculture. And I won't go into the details here. It's detailed in the Tackling the Farm Crisis and Climate Crisis report that some of you may have already seen. It's available on the NFU website. And the NFU isn't advocating this at this time, but we would like farmers to see what a well-designed, functional carbon tax and refund system would look like before they make a decision about this. It could be part of a solution along with a lot of other things. So just to quickly recap, in terms of nitrogen, we need to use it more efficiently, we need to use less of it, and we need to produce it without emissions. On the cropping side, we need to diversify our production systems. We need to use better rotations, more cover crops, more organics, agroecology, etc. We also need minimum input systems like mint agriculture. On the cattle side, we need to maximize the benefits like soil health, while reducing impacts, emissions, and probably reducing the number slightly. On fuel and energy use, we need to electrify everything possible. On land use, we need to set aside some of our land. In terms of institutions, we need several new institutions, and one could be a Canadian Farm Resilience Authority to sort of oversee and help farmers, support them in making these transitions. And finally, to a limited extent, we might want to use some price signals in the form of a carbon tax and refund system. So that concludes my presentation. I'll just mention again the report that the National Farmers Union published about 8 to 10 months ago. It's called Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, a transformative strategy for Canadian farms and food systems. If you want a hard copy, get in touch with the NFU National Office in Saskatoon. We've got hard copies. We'd be happy to mail you one. There's copies on the web as well. I could put a number of them in the mail. We can send them down to your New Brunswick or PEI offices if you like to. So my name is Darrin Qualman. I'm the Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action with the National Farmers Union. Very, very pleased to have had this opportunity to speak to you tonight. Thank you very much.